Okay, so welcome to part 2, where we're going to discuss life course criminology and the risk and protective factors that can either cause a young person to commit crime or stop them from doing so. But what is life course criminology, also known as developmental criminology? So it's concerned with three main issues, and we look at how people change in psychology over the life course. So why not criminology? So we're looking at behaviour in different stages. So the development of offending and antisocial behaviour, we want to find out when did they start offending, the types of crime that they did, when did they stop, did they go back, or did they desist forever? So all of those things are under the development of offending and antisocial behaviour. We're looking at the risk and protective factors at different ages. So a risk factor as a teenager could be having delinquent peers. You might still have these same friends at an older age, such as in your 30s, but in your 30s, having grown up a bit, you might not be so affected by them. So the peer pressure would disappear. So risk and protective factors and the effects of life events. So what happens in life to prevent you from offending? Well, one of the things, funnily enough, that stops a lot of young men from offending is being in a relationship and getting married. So being married can actually be a life event that stops people from committing crime. Unfortunately, if the relationship goes bust and they get divorced, then that can cause them to restart their criminal activity. So we're concerned with documenting and explaining within individual changes. So this is psychological only. Interested in following people across their life course to see why they change. We're only looking here at individual change, not group change. All right, this is an example of a life history plot. So this is the life history of a sex offender from birth to 50 years of age. I don't know if you can see my pointer, I hope so. But if you look at the orange section here, that shows that from the ages of about 10 to maybe his mid-teens, 14, 15, he was in foster care. Okay, at that stage, in his time, he had his first sexual relationship with a 26-year-old female. He also committed his first property crimes. He went into custody at that time, so maybe for a couple of years, 15 to 17 or so, he was in custody. Released again, and before he'd even turned 20, he was committing more property crime and went back into custody. So if you look at the table on the side, these colours here all represent the types of crimes that he committed, and that was between 20 and 30 that he committed those crimes. Now, I know we said that marriage can work to stop people from committing crime, but in the case of this man, it didn't, because he got married in that small gap there in the middle of his 20s where he was not in custody, and ended up back in custody before that marriage ended just before he was 30. But it did actually cause or mean that, well, there were 2 children. The outcome was that there were 2 children. Okay, so if you move on into his 30s, and now he has committed sex offences, which is the red ones. Interesting that there was some sort of accident or trauma, but it was between the first and the second sex offences. So you couldn't say that whatever the accident or trauma was, that it caused him to become a sex offender, because he already was. But obviously his miscellaneous crime spree continued as the bubble's gotten bigger and bigger. So if you look over here on the left, you can see that there should be pink for employment. There is absolutely no pink along his timeline at all, and he's never been employed, and he's also never been in the military, and he's also never had a psych evaluation. Okay, so this just gives you an example of how we might do a life history plot on someone by laying out their life and putting all of their offences on them. And as you can see, by the length of the vertical lines, his offending must have been quite high. Okay. All right, so these are the important concepts. Throughout our life, we have lots of change, And some of it can be really good change, some of it can be bad change, but we have a pathway, and that pathway is just your life. So this is your narrative and story and everything that's happened to you that shapes you. So it's over time and social situations, and it's just the story that you tell. That's your pathway. Your transition is a movement from one stage of life stage to the next. So it could be going from being single to being married. It could be going from school to university. And this can be a time when crime occurs because people just don't cope with a lot of change. And a turning point is quite a personalised event. So the transitions in the transition and pathway section, they're pretty universal. A turning point is a event that is something that happens more to you alone. So it could be having a friend die, or it could be having an illness, like a life-threatening illness like cancer, something that really only happens to you, and it can have a profound effect on you and cause changes. So the risk factors are what's shown to be associated with negative outcomes later in life, and protective factors are the ones that stop you from taking that pathway that lead to bad outcomes, and they take you off towards positive outcomes. Okay, and we're going to talk about risk and protective factors in more depth in a moment. So what are the antecedents to adolescent offenders? What are the background factors or precursors to offending? Well, there's a lot of parenting related antecedents, and these can include punitive child rearing practices where there's a lot of physical abuse and a lot of shouting and a lot of conflict between the parents and the children. An absence of love or rejection, not being cared for. So the child is just more or less just left alone. Poor monitoring and supervision, especially in the younger years, particularly poor monitoring when they don't care where the child is. Family disruption, such as divorce or having a parent in prison. And deviant parental characteristics. So parents who are criminal themselves and are in prison, it's a very, very high risk for delinquency in young people. Okay, I just want you to watch and listen to this. This is the interview that Bianca Stone from Channel 7 did with 3 young men who are into this car stealing stuff. You won't be able to open the link. You'll have to copy it and paste it. But she does at one stage ask them about their families, and some of what I've just discussed on the previous slide is really obvious from these kids as well. So have a listen to what these young people have to say. So there are some studies that we do to look at to try and understand what the risk and protective factors are. So we do longitudinal research, longitudinal experimental studies, and cross-sectional studies. You're going to learn a lot about these in your course with Mayessa. So I am going to explain them to you, but you'll do them in a lot more depth with her. All right, longitudinal. This is where we look at someone from birth for as long through their life as we can. This is a fantastic way to do research because you're looking at the same person over a long period of time. But there are some inherent problems with this type of research. Obviously, it takes many, many years, and every time you want to talk to the person again, you've got to go and find them. So you might start with a very, very big group, but over time it can become quite difficult to find them, so your group will shrink. People die when they're on these types of research projects. So once they've died, you don't have access to them anymore. So it's a really great way to do research, but it's not always practical. Then we've got longitudinal experimental studies. So this is where you take a group of individuals and you split them into 2 groups. One group will get the intervention, one group will get no intervention, and then we look at what the outcome is for each group. How's it decided which group they should be in? Well, usually it's done randomly. So you might start off with a group of babies and they be getting home visits by nurses when the child is a baby. Only half get that help. Okay, so only half are getting that visit from the nurse when the child is a baby, and that can be help with information, teaching, and help around the house. The other half are not getting this intervention. So what's the problem with this type of study? Well, the problem with it is the ethics behind it, because you're selecting a group that are at risk anyway and then giving half of them nothing. So you have to figure out if it's ethical if one group goes on to commit a crime because they didn't receive the help that was on offer. Probably very hard to get permission to do these. You have to get permission to do any study and you have to do an ethical proposal. So it would be much harder to get that these days. Do any of you know what a cross-sectional study is? Well, you might go and ask one person a whole heap of questions about their life, but not follow up with them every few years. You can look at one group of people now and ask them lots and lots of questions. Then in a few years, you might find another group with the same demographic as your first group and ask them the same questions. So to give you an example, I started teaching at Griffith College in 2016. Could have taken my class in 2016, asked them a whole heap of questions, come back in 2020, pick you as the cohort that's there now in my class and ask you all the same questions. So the research questions themselves stay the same, the people change, but they are from the same cohort. There are always issues with asking people questions, and when you're asking people lots of questions about their past, one of the biggest problems that you will face is their memory. All right, let's move on to the risk and protective factors. So first of all, we'll start with the individual. And I forgot to change the print to black. Probably the only one I missed. Never mind, it looks fine. Okay, so there's different levels: individual, family, school, and society or community, which all play a part in risk and protective factors. So in the individual, the risk factors are, if you've got a child with low IQ, they don't achieve very well at school, they're hyperactive, they just can't sit still, they're impulsive, they act without thinking, they take a lot of risk. They have a history of antisocial behaviour, so they might be a biter or a kicker and have no real friends. Neurological problems or perinatal difficulty. Perinatal difficulty can be exposure to toxins during pregnancy or postnatal depression in the mother. The protective factors in the individual are social competence, social skills, attachment to family, moral beliefs, values, good coping style. So they've got good problem solving and resilience. But more importantly, they have a family that is invested in them. You can still have a hyperactive, risk-taking child, but if they have a really, really strong attachment to their family, that can be the buffer to stop them from going into crime. What are the risk and protective factors for family? Well, you can see there's a lot more risk factors than there are protective factors, so those protective factors can be really, really strong ones. So, poor parental supervision, not knowing where the child is and not caring where the child is. Harsh discipline, inconsistent discipline where the child doesn't know from one incident to the next what they're going to get as discipline, so there's no consistency. Cold parental attitude, rejection of the child. Parental conflict or divorce and separation. Criminal parents, delinquent siblings, or parental substance abuse. Very, very big family risk factors. And socioeconomic, low family income, poverty, large family size. A lot of kids in a family is a risk factor because it's related to things like supervision. So Ivan Milat, for instance, came from a very, very large family. And parental unemployment. So socioeconomic family risk factors are very evident. What are the protective factors in the family? Well, having caring parents, having family harmony, so not a lot of fighting, not a lot of aggression, parents who are invested in their children, who want to know where they are, who have consistent discipline and a lot of love in the family, and small family size, so not a huge number of children. And increasingly families are getting smaller. The big family is more a rarity than a norm these days. School and peers. So the risk factors at school with peers, delinquent peers, peer rejection. Think about not being popular at school. That is a really big one for young people, and that was the problem with the Columbine shooters. They were rejected by their peers, and low popularity. And in school, bullying, high delinquency rated school, poor community, under-resourced school, so there's not a lot of good school activities, and a poor parent-teacher relationship with the school. Okay, so if the school itself has issues, then they are risk factors. Protective factors: positive school climate, pro-social peer group, sense of attachment to the school, and attachment to the school norms. This all starts to make sense, doesn't it, if you think about yourselves and your journey through school and through family life. I'm sure you can look back now and see young people who maybe have gone off the track and seen that they had a lot of these risk or protective factors to stop them or cause them to do it. Last one, the neighbourhood or the community. So if you live in a neighbourhood that has poverty, poor access to resources, high crime and violence, and it's a socially disorganised neighbourhood. Well, what does this mean? This is a neighbourhood where people don't really know each other and they don't care. There's no social activities in the neighbourhood for young people. Less likely then to know who should and shouldn't be there. So it makes it more easy, which is terrible English. It makes it easier for people who might have criminal thoughts to be there without really being noticed. Whereas a neighbourhood that has access to support services, community networking, community and cultural norms against violence, and a high socioeconomic status is more likely to be protective factors. So if the community itself makes it quite clear that they are against violence and will be working in the community to make sure it doesn't happen. And I had a little, there he is, my safety house man. A lot of you don't know anymore what safety house is. I used to be a safety house. So the safety house was a community volunteer program, where a child, if they saw a house and with the symbol, the safety house symbol on their letterbox, and they were having any sorts of issues, they knew that they could go to that house and they would be safe. That person had been vetted and was a safe person to go to. So I used to be a safety house because I lived about 3 doors from my kids' school. And yeah, that was something that I used to do in the community to help out. Okay, so these risk and protective factors are all intercorrelated and they're cumulative. The number that you've got is important. So if you've got 10 risk factors, that's more putting you at greater risk than if you've only got 2. And different risk factors matter at different times. So parents and family are more important at a younger age, while peers or your friends are more important at teenagers. Yoshikawa, who wrote this piece of research, wrote of the importance of early childhood programs which seek to ameliorate the effects of the factors. So we're talking here about programs that work with very, very young children to stop it from beginning in the first place, providing intensive family support, early education services and programs. Because the cost effectiveness of these programs is the decrease in the costs associated with juveniles committing crime. Okay, that is the end of part 2. In part 3, we're going to discuss studies that have researched the precursors of antisocial behaviour. So go and get a coffee, a drink or whatever and come back for part 3.